All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a pretty massive topic, and I think you're going to like this one. We're diving into GitHub, trying to really wrap our heads around, what makes it tick, what makes it so important.
Yeah, this is one of those platforms it's just kind of everywhere in software development. And we've got a ton of material here, research, articles, a real mixed bag. So we're going to try and synthesize it all and really understand GitHub's journey, its impact, where it stands today,
Absolutely. So let's kick things off with the fundamentals. When we talk about GitHub, what are we really talking about at its core?
At its most basic, it's a platform, right? A platform built for developers to create, to store, to manage, and most importantly, share their code.
Okay, so it's a place for code, but what makes it different from, say, just saving files on your computer?
Well, that's where Git comes in. GitHub is built on top of Git, which is a version control system. It tracks every single change made to the code. Think of it like a super detailed history of your project, so you can always go back to previous versions if needed.
I see. So it's like having a time machine for your code. But GitHub adds a whole lot more to the mix, doesn't it?
It does. It layers on all sorts of tools. You have things like access control, so you can determine who can see and modify your code. Then there's bug tracking, helping developers find and squash those pesky errors.
And there's managing feature requests, keeping track of all the new things people want to add to a project.
Right, and keeping everything organized with task management tools. Then there's the whole world of continuous integration, automating the testing process so you can catch errors early, and even built-in wikis so teams can document their projects.
It sounds like a real Swiss Army knife for developers.
Yeah, it really is. It's become pretty much indispensable for anyone working with code. And to give you an idea of just how big it is, by January of 2023, there were over 100 million developers on GitHub working on over 420 million repositories.
That is a mind-boggling number of projects. And I understand a good chunk of those are open source, right?
You're right. At least 28 million of those repositories are public. And that actually makes GitHub the world's biggest host of source code as of June 2023. We're talking 5 billion contributions to over 500 million open source projects just in 2024 alone.
That is just a massive amount of collaboration happening. So where did this all begin?
Well, GitHub was officially founded on February 8th, 2008. The four founders are Tom Preston-Murner, Chris Wanstrath, PJ Hyatt, and Scott Chicon.
And the name itself, GitHub, it's pretty self-explanatory, right?
Yeah, it's a blend of Git, which is the underlying version control system, and Hub, reflecting its role as this central meeting place for developers.
Makes sense. So they launched in 2008. Take us back to those early days. What was the company culture like?
Well, one thing that really stands out is that they adopted a very flat organizational structure. It wasn't your typical top-down hierarchy with layers of managers. They were big on self-management, giving employees a lot of autonomy.
And I understand they had this interesting approach to work allocation.
Oh, yeah. Their system was called open allocation. Basically, employees could choose which projects they wanted to work on, which is pretty radical, especially back then.
Sounds like a pretty empowering environment, though I read that the CEO still had the final say on salaries.
That's right. But overall, it seemed like a pretty progressive and flexible way to run a company.
So with this unique setup, how did they fare in those early years?
Their growth was pretty phenomenal, actually. Within the first year, they had over 46,000 public repositories, and that number was exploding, particularly in that last month leading up to their one-year mark.
And it wasn't just about storing code, right? People were actively collaborating.
Oh, absolutely. Around 6,200 of those repositories had already been forked, meaning developers had created their own copies to work on independently. And nearly 4,600 of those forks were merged back into the original projects. It really demonstrated the power of that collaborative approach.
So GitHub was clearly gaining traction. What about the user base? How quickly was that growing?
By the end of 2009, they had over 100,000 users, and they were hosting 90,000 unique public repositories. About 12,000 of those had been forked, so the total repository count was around 135,000.
And that growth just continued to snowball, didn't it?
It really did. In 2010, they hit 1 million repositories, and then just a year later, they doubled that to 2 million. By mid-2011, they were actually surpassing those more established platforms like SourceForge and Google Code in terms of total commits, the number of changes saved to the code base.
So they were becoming the go-to platform for developers.
Exactly. By early 2013, they had 3 million users and over 5 million repositories. And get this, by the end of that same year, they'd hit 10 million repositories.
That's some serious growth. And that kind of expansion requires fuel, right? How are they funding all of this?
Well, at first it was all bootstrapped. The founders were funding it themselves. They seemed to be generating enough revenue early on, and they started hiring. But then to really scale up, they needed outside investment.
Right, and that's when Andreessen Horowitz came in.
Exactly. In July of 2012, they secured a $100 million investment from Andreessen Horowitz, which valued GitHub at $750 million. A pretty clear sign that investors saw huge potential.
And then they raised another huge round a few years later.
Yeah, in July 2015, they raised another $250 million, led by Sequoia Capital, and that bumped their valuation to around $2 billion. By 2023, they were estimated to be making around $1 billion annually.
That's quite the financial trajectory. And it wasn't just about the money and the users. They were also expanding their physical presence.
Right. In 2015, they opened their first international office in Japan,
marking their first step towards becoming a truly global company. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. There were some challenges along the way. And I specifically remember hearing about a pretty significant cyber attack.
You're talking about the DDoS attack in 2018, right?
That's the one. It was massive.
It was. On February 28, 2018, GitHub was hit with one of the largest DDoS attacks ever recorded. The incoming traffic peaked at a staggering 1.35 terabits per second. It essentially flooded their servers with data, making the platform inaccessible.
That must have been a real stress test for their infrastructure.
It was, but they managed to get back up and running relatively quickly. It just goes to show you how important robust cybersecurity is for a platform like GitHub.
No doubt. Now, one of the biggest turning points in GitHub's history was the acquisition by Microsoft.
Yeah, that sent shockwaves through the tech world. On June 4th, 2018, Microsoft announced they were buying GitHub for $7.5 billion. The deal was finalized in October of that year.
A massive acquisition. What was the thinking behind it? Why did Microsoft make that move?
It was definitely strategic. Microsoft, under Satya Nadella, was placing a big emphasis on cloud computing. And part of that strategy was embracing open source software, which, GitHub is a huge proponent of.
So it fit into their broader vision. And wasn't Microsoft already a major player in the open source world?
Oh, yeah, they were. Even before the acquisition, back in 2016, Microsoft was already a top contributor to open source on GitHub. Projects like .NET Core and Visual Studio Code, their own documentation was increasingly hosted on GitHub as well.
Right. So the acquisition made sense from that perspective. But I remember there being a lot of apprehension in the developer community.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There was a lot of unease, people wondering what would happen to GitHub under Microsoft. Microsoft had a history of, maybe not always handling acquisitions in the best way, like what happened with Nokia and Skype.
Yeah, people were worried GitHub might lose its independent spirit.
Exactly. And there was a noticeable uptick in interest in competing platforms like Bitbucket, GitLab, even SourceForge. People were nervous, looking for alternatives.
So what happened? Did GitHub change drastically after the acquisition?
It's tricky. There were definitely some leadership changes. Initially, Nat Friedman, who had co-founded Xamarin, another company Microsoft had acquired, was brought in to lead GitHub.
Right. And he reported to Scott Guthrie, one of the big players in Microsoft's cloud and AI division.
Exactly. But then, in November 2021, Friedman stepped down and Thomas Dohmke took over as CEO.
And during this time, GitHub continued to grow and even make its own acquisitions.
Yeah. In September 2019, they bought Simmel, a company that specialized in code analysis tools.
And then the big one, the acquisition of NPM.
Right, that was a big deal. NPM is the package manager for JavaScript, so essentially a critical part of the JavaScript development ecosystem. That deal was announced in March 2020 and finalized the next month.
So they were consolidating their influence in the JavaScript world, and they were also expanding geographically.
Yeah, in February 2020, they launched GitHub India Private Limited, showing their interest in this massive and rapidly growing developer market.
Now, one of the things that always impressed me about GitHub is their long-term thinking, and a great example of that is the GitHub Archive program.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating project. It launched in early July 2020. The goal is to preserve open source code basically forever.
Forever. That's a long
I know, right? They took a snapshot of all public repositories as of February 2, 2020, and they stored it in the Arctic World Archive up in Svalbard, Norway.
So it's safe and sound in a decommissioned coal mine in the Arctic. Talk about safeguarding humanity's knowledge.
It's like a backup for civilization, at least for the open source world.
Okay, so we've talked about the history, the growth, the acquisitions. Let's get into the nuts and bolts. What actually makes GitHub so valuable to developers, the core features and functionality?
Well, first and foremost, it integrates seamlessly with the standard Git command line interface. So for developers who are used to working with Git commands, it's a very natural transition.
But for those who prefer a more visual approach, there are other options too, right?
Exactly. There are tons of user-friendly desktop clients and Git plugins available.
And it's not just about the technical side. GitHub also has that social element, that sense of community.
It really does. It borrows a lot from social media. You have activity feeds, so you can keep up with projects you're interested in. You can follow other developers whose work you admire.
Right. And there are wikis for collaborative documentation, powered by a system called Golem.
Oh, and you can't forget that social network graph. It visually shows how developers are collaborating on different versions or forks of a project and which version is the most up to date.
So you can see the branches of development and how they all connect. What about managing access to projects? Who can see your code and who can contribute?
Well, public repositories on GitHub are open for anyone to view and download. But to actually contribute to a project, you need to register for an account.
Okay, so you need an account to make changes. But what about those private repositories, the ones you don't want to share publicly?
Initially, there were limitations on how many collaborators you could have on a free private repository. But then, in a big move, they made all the core features, including unlimited collaborators on private repositories free for everyone.
That was huge. It really opened up the platform to individual developers and smaller teams.
It did. It really democratized access to those tools.
Now let's talk about the underlying technology. What actually powers GitHub?
Well, like we've said, it's built on Git, the distributed version control system created by Linus Torvalds, who was also the creator of Linux. But the platform itself, the website and everything, was built using Ruby on Rails.
Okay, so Ruby on Rails provides that web interface.
And to handle all those millions of users, they use Erlang, which is known for its ability to manage tons of concurrent processes.
So Git for the version control, Ruby on Rails for the web interface, and Erlang for the heavy lifting. Got it. Now, what are some of the core tasks that GitHub helps developers with?
Well, like we've touched on, the big ones are version control and issue tracking. With version control, GitHub, well, Git really, lets developers track every change to their code, go back to previous versions, and collaborate with others.
Right, and that collaborative workflow is where features like pull requests come in.
Exactly. Pull requests let developers propose changes to the code base in a controlled way. Other developers can review those changes, provide feedback, even request modifications. And once everything looks good, those changes can be integrated into the main project.
It's like a structured way to get everyone on the same page and ensure code quality. What about issue tracking?
GitHub has a robust issue tracking system. You can use labels to categorize different types of issues, set milestones to track progress towards specific goals. You can even assign tasks to different developers and use the built-in search engine to find specific issues.
So it's about keeping track of all those bugs, improvements, and new features that need attention. Beyond those core features, what are some of the other tools and functionalities that GitHub offers?
Oh, there's a whole bunch. For documentation, GitHub can automatically render those README files, the files that explain what a project is about. It supports various formats like Markdown, so you can have nicely formatted documentation.
Makes it easy to explain what your project is all about.
Yeah. And then there are the wikis. Some repositories are even entirely dedicated to wiki content. There are those popular awesome lists, which are curated lists of recommended software and resources on various topics.
Like those awesome Python or awesome JavaScript lists that people love. What about for those who want a more streamlined development experience?
They have GitHub Codespaces. It's like a complete online development environment, a virtual machine that's pre-configured for coding, and you can access it right in your browser.
So you can just dive right into coding without having to set up a development environment on your own machine. Super convenient.
It is, especially for quick edits or if you're working on the go. And to understand project activity and who's contributing, they have all these cool graphs. You've got the pulse graph for recent activity overview, the contributors graph showing who's been working on the project, commits graph tracking code changes, and even a network graph to visualize how different forks of a project are related.
I love those visualizations. They really help to see the big picture. And there's a directory for integrations as well, right?
Yes. The integrations directory lets you find and connect third-party tools and services to your projects. They also have email notifications to keep you in the loop and discussions for those more open-ended conversations about a project.
And don't forget those handy @mentions so you can directly notify specific collaborators.
Oh, and emojis. Emojis are always good. They also have nested task lists within files so you can organize your to-dos better. You can visualize geospatial data right on the platform and even preview 3D models like STL files directly in your browser using a WebGL viewer.
They've really thought of everything. Now, for larger organizations that have those more specific security needs, they have GitHub Enterprise.
Right. GitHub Enterprise has been around since November 2011, and it's a self-hosted version. It provides similar functionality to the cloud-based platform, but allows organizations to deploy it on their own infrastructure or private cloud.
I remember an incident where some of the source code for GitHub Enterprise Server was leaked online.
Yeah, that was in November 2020. GitHub clarified it wasn't a security breach, but rather they accidentally shared the code with their enterprise customers themselves. Oops.
Little bit of an embarrassing oversight. Now, what about for people who want to host a simple website like a blog or project documentation?
GitHub has a service for that called GitHub Pages. It was launched back in 2008, and it's specifically designed for hosting static websites.
Static meaning like not a dynamic website with a database and all that.
Exactly. The content is stored as files in a Git repository, which are then served directly to visitors. It integrates with Jekyll, a popular static site generator, and even supports GitHub Actions for automating deployments.
So every time you update your site's content, it can automatically rebuild and deploy the website.
Yep, super convenient. It offers free and paid tiers, and you can use a GitHub subdomain or connect your custom domain name and secure it with HTTPS.
Very cool. And one of the more recent and powerful additions to GitHub is GitHub Actions.
Actions was officially launched in November of 2019, although it was announced the year before. It lets you automate workflows, especially for continuous integration and continuous deployment, or CI/CD for short.
So you can automate the building, testing, and deploying of your software right within GitHub.
Exactly. They also launched with this marketplace where you can find and reuse actions created by other developers. It's all about making the development process smoother.
And to run those automated workflows, they have these hosted runners.
Right. The runners are basically virtual machines that can dynamically scale to meet your needs, so you don't have to manage your own servers.
That's a big time saver for developers. Oh, and before we move on, we have to talk about Gist. It's like GitHub's little brother, right?
Yeah, Gist is great. It's a Pastebin-style site specifically designed for sharing code snippets. Launched in 2008, same as GitHub Pages. While GitHub is for larger projects, Gist is perfect for sharing smaller pieces of code or configurations.
It's like a quick and dirty way to share code.
But it still has that version control aspect. Each Gist is essentially a mini Git repository. Until March 2018, anyone could upload, but then they restricted it to logged-in users to cut down on spam.
So even your quick code snippets have a history and can be tracked.
I love that.
Now, beyond all these cool features, GitHub is also known for its strong commitment to community and education.
Yeah, they invest a lot in supporting students and the open source community. A big part of that is the GitHub Student Developer Pack, which they launched in 2014.
That pack is a goldmine for students. It gives them free access to a whole bunch of development tools and services.
It really does. They partner with companies like Bitnami, DigitalOcean, Unreal Engine, and many others to provide students with those industry-standard tools. It's a great way to level the playing field and give students a head start.
It's such a valuable resource. And they also run the GitHub Campus Experts program, right?
Yes, launched in 2016. The goal is to train students to become tech leaders and help them build thriving tech communities at the universities. It's open to anyone 18 and older, and they often use this program to provide funding for student-run tech events and initiatives.
So they're actively involved in nurturing the next generation of tech leaders. And for those who want to directly support the open source projects they love, there's GitHub Sponsors.
Right. GitHub Sponsors launched in May 2019. It's a platform where users can make monthly donations to open source projects and developers. It's similar to Patreon, where developers can offer different tiers and perks for their sponsors.
It's a great way to give back to those who create the tools and software that power so much of our digital world. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. GitHub has faced its fair share of controversies over the years.
Yeah, like any large platform, they've had to navigate some pretty complex issues. One of the early controversies was back in 2014, with allegations of harassment against co-founder and then CEO Tom Preston-Werner and his wife.
That was a pretty big deal at the time.
It was. GitHub conducted an internal investigation, And the findings confirmed that Preston Werner had acted inappropriately, including confrontational behavior and not handling his wife's presence in the workplace well. He ended up resigning as a result.
It really sparked a conversation about workplace culture and the importance of addressing harassment in the tech industry.
Absolutely. More recently, GitHub has been under fire for its policies on sanctions and censorship. Starting in July 2019, they began restricting access for developers in certain countries.
This was due to U.S. trade control laws, right?
Yes. Places like Iran, Crimea, Cuba, North Korea, and Syria. They initially blocked access to private repositories, then restored access to public repositories and GitHub pages. But restrictions on using VPNs and proxies to access from those sanctioned areas remain.
So there are still barriers for developers in those regions, and that's not the only instance of censorship that GitHub has been involved in.
Unfortunately, no. In December 2014, Russia temporarily blacklisted GitHub for refusing to remove content related to suicide. Later, they unblocked it when GitHub agreed to block specific pages.
And there was a brief block in India that same month over ISIS-related content.
Right, and Turkey blocked it in 2016, apparently to hide leaks. Then there was that massive DDoS attack in March 2015, suspected to be from China, which was targeting content related to bypassing internet censorship.
And then there was the detention of those volunteers who were archiving censored Chinese content on GitHub.
Yeah, that was the Terminus 2049 project. They were detained by Chinese police in April 2020.
It's a reminder that GitHub is a global platform, and with that comes a whole set of challenges. Another controversy that caused a lot of debate was the ICE contract.
That one was big. GitHub had a contract with ICE, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, for their on-premises product, GitHub Enterprise Server.
And despite a lot of internal and external opposition, they renewed that contract in 2019.
Yeah, a lot of employees were upset, and many even resigned in protest. They felt it was unethical to do business with ICE, given the agency's human rights record. Nat Friedman, the CEO at the time, tried to address concerns, but the controversy persisted.
It really highlighted the ethical dilemmas that tech companies face. Then there was that incident in early 2021, right after the Capitol riot.
Oh yeah, GitHub fired an employee who had expressed concern for his colleagues' safety during the riot, using the word Nazis in internal communications to describe some of the rioters.
That caused a huge backlash.
It did. People accused GitHub of stifling free speech. They ended up conducting an internal investigation, found errors in judgment, and reached out to the employee. Their head of HR resigned because of the whole ordeal.
It shows how difficult it is for companies to navigate these sensitive political situations. And then there was the Twitter source code leak.
Ah, yes. In 2023, parts of Twitter's source code ended up on GitHub. Twitter took legal action to find the user who uploaded it, but it highlighted how GitHub can be a platform for both legitimate sharing and, well, potential intellectual property violations.
It's a double-edged sword. It's fascinating to see how GitHub has become this battleground for various issues. And before we wrap up, I'm curious to know, what does Linus Torvalds, the creator of Git, think about all of this?
Torvalds has had a, shall we say, complicated relationship with GitHub. Back in 2012, he praised them for making it so easy to host open source projects.
He acknowledged their contribution to making open source more accessible.
He did, but he's also been critical of GitHub's implementation of certain features, like the merging interface for pull requests. He called it totally inferior to Git's own system.
So he appreciates the platform, but isn't afraid to call out what he sees as shortcomings.
Exactly. He's a straight shooter, that's for sure.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from GitHub's humble beginnings to its acquisition by Microsoft, explored its features, its community focus, and those controversies that have shaped its journey.
It's really fascinating to see how it's grown from a small startup to a giant in the software development world.
It's clear that GitHub has had a profound impact on how software is developed and shared globally. It's more than just a code repository. It's a platform for collaboration, innovation, and even social and political debate.
For you, the listener, it's worth reflecting on the implications of a platform like this being owned by a giant corporation. How will that shape the future of open source?
It's a big question. What will the balance between accessibility and corporate control look like in the years to come?
It's an evolving landscape, and GitHub is right at the center of it.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. But hopefully this has given you a better understanding of GitHub's fascinating and complex world.
If anything sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to keep digging. There's a wealth of information out there.
And who knows, maybe you'll even find yourself contributing to an open source project on GitHub one day.
Until next time.